Beau. If you knew that, welcome back. If you didn't, welcome to my channel. I am excited to have you either way. So today what I have planned is a little book narration session. I love reading aloud. It is one of my favorite things to do, and I love listening to people read aloud as well. But my favorite book series in the entire world is called Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. I actually have the book right here. I really love this book series. I've been reading it since I was around 12. It was middle school when I found this book series. The hardcover, like the teal hardcover, really stood out to me. And it was like embossed with this like gold writing for the title. I have the soft cover version. Let's look at John Green's review of the book because he's a trustworthy guy. He said it's a tense, moving, and wondrously strange first novel. The photographs and text work together brilliantly to create an unforgettable story. He said it better than I could have because I was about to go off on a big old tangent about how he uses like old antique photos that he found from flea shops and creates this incredible world. Ransom Riggs is one of my biggest inspirations for my creativity in general. So, and he continues to be, he was when I was a kid and he still is now. So, without further ado, let me introduce the actual book that I'll be reading. So, the reason why I introduced you to the book series is because the book that I'm reading is like a little universe enhancement. Also, if you hear like sneezing and stuff, it's just my cat. He is sleeping, but he's a menace, regardless if he's asleep or awake. But I distracted myself by thinking about my cat. Where was I? Oh, yes. You know what? What if I just like read the foreword because I think it will help. So, just read one. I think that I'm going to read The Girl Who Could Tame Nightmares, but we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 stories to choose from, plus the foreword, which I will be reading in this video because I think it helps make sense of what the hell is going on in this universe. Also, peep this illustration. Apple of my eye. Alright. Dear reader, the book you hold in your hands is meant for peculiar eyes only. If by chance you are not among the ranks of the anomalous, in other words, if you don't find yourself floating out of bed in the middle of the night because you forgot to tie yourself to the mattress, sprouting flames from the palms of your hands at inopportune times, or chewing food with the mouth in the back of your head, then please put this book back where you found it at once and forget this ever happened. Don't worry, you won't be missing anything. I'm sure you'd only find these stories contained herein strange, distressing, and altogether not to your liking. And anyway, they're none of your business. Very peculiarly yours, the publisher. Just for context, the publisher's note and the foreword are both written by fictional characters. I don't know who the first one is. It's just a random peculiar publisher, but the foreword is written by our beloved Millard Nullings, who is our invisible historian. And I believe that's Millard, unless Millard is the one with the bees. That might be Horace. Not me being a fake fan. It has been years since I've read the series. Do forgive me. But the foreword. And I'm going to give him a little accent because they are from, well, some of them are from the UK, a lot of them are from the US, but they have more of that transatlantic accent kind of thing going on, so I'm going to try to do that. But I might just turn into a British accent, forewarning. If you are of the peculiar persuasion, and you've read this far, I sincerely hope that you are, then this is a book that likely needs no introduction. These tales were a formative and beloved part of your upbringing, and you came of age reading them and hearing them read aloud with such frequency that you can recite your favorites word for word. If, however, you are among those unfortunates who have only just discovered their peculiarity, or who grew up in circumstances where no peculiar literature was available, I offer this brief primer. Tales of the Peculiar is a collection of our most beloved folklore, passed down from generation to generation since time immemorial. Each story is part history, part fairy tale, and part moral lesson aimed at young peculiars. These tales hail from various parts of the globe, from oral as well as written traditions, and they have gone through striking transformations over the years. They have survived as long as they have because they are loved for their merits as stories But they are more than that, too. They are also the bearers of secret knowledge. Encoded within their pages are the locations of hidden loops, the secret identities of certain important peculiars, and other information that could aid in a peculiar survival in this hostile world. I should know. The tales are the reason I'm alive to write these words now. They preserved not only my life, but those of my friends and our beloved inbreed. Don't worry, we'll explain what an inbreed is later. I, Millet Nullings, am a living testament to the enduring usefulness of these stories, though they were written many years ago. That's why I've devoted myself to their preservation and dissemination, and taken it upon myself to edit and annotate, or complete, the edition I grew up reading. Oh, I think I totally skipped a line. Hold on, let me go back. Yeah, I totally did. Okay. That's why I've devoted myself to their preservation and dissemination, and taken it upon myself to edit and annotate this special edition of the tales. It is by no means exhaustive or complete. The edition I grew up reading was a famously unwieldy three-volume set that weighed collectively more than my friend Bronwyn. For context, Bronwyn's peculiarity is strength, super strength, and she weighs a lot because she's mainly muscle. But the stories contained here represent my very favorites, and I have taken the liberty of annotating them with historical and contextual insights so that peculiars everywhere may benefit from my wisdom. It's also my hope that this edition, being more portable than previous ones, will be an easy companion on your travels and adventures, and may prove itself as useful to you as it once did to me. So please, enjoy these tales before a crackling fire on a chilly night. Ideally, a snoring grim bear at your feet. But remember, too, their sensitive nature. And if you must read them aloud, which I highly recommend, make certain your audience is peculiar. Millard Nullings. His little signature. Shall we? Being 13 minutes in, I think we shall. You know what? I think I'm just going to start from the beginning. The Splendid Cannibals. I want you to take a look at this illustration here. The peculiars in the village of Swamp Muck lived very modestly. They were farmers, and though they didn't own fancy things and lived in flimsy houses made of reeds, they were healthy and joyful and wanted for little. Food grew bountifully in their gardens, clean water ran in their streams, and even their humble homes seemed like luxuries because the weather in Swamp Muck was so fair, and the villagers were so devoted to their work that many, after a long day of mucking, would simply lie down and sleep in their swamps. Harvest was their favorite time of year. Working round the clock, they gathered the best weeds that had grown in the swamp that season, bundled them onto donkey carts, and drove their bounty to the market town of Chipping Whippet. A 5 days ride. 5 days ride. It was difficult work. The swamp weed was rough and tore their hands. The donkeys were ill-tempered and apt to bite. The road to the market was pitted with holes and plagued by thieves. There were often grievous accidents, such as when Farmer Pullman, in a fit of overzealous harvesting, accidentally scythed off his neighbor's leg. The neighbor, Farmer Hayworth, was understandably upset, but the villagers were such agreeable people that all was soon forgiven. The money they earned at market was paltry, but enough to buy necessities and some rations of goat rump. Besides, and with that rare treat as their centerpiece, they threw a raucous party. Honestly, I don't know really what that word means or how to pronounce it, but it is spelt R-A-U-C-O-U-S. Raucous, raucous. They threw a festival that went on for days. That very year, just after the festival had ended, and the villagers were about to return to their toil in the swamps, 3 visitors arrived. Swamp Muck rarely had visitors of any kind, as it was not the sort of place people wanted to visit. And it had certainly never had visitors like these. 2 men and a lady dressed head to toe in lush brocaded silk, riding on the backs of three fine Arabian horses. But though the visitors were obviously rich, they looked emaciated and swayed weakly in their bejeweled saddles. The villagers gathered around them curiously, marveling at their beautiful clothes and horses. "Don't get too close," Farmer Sally warned. "They look as if they might be sick." "We're on a journey to the coast of Meek," explained one of the visitors, a man who seemed to be the only one strong enough to speak. "We were accosted by bandits some weeks ago, and though we were able to outrun them, we got badly lost. We've been turning circles ever since, looking for the old Roman road." "You're nowhere near the Roman road," said Farmer Sally. I cannot pick an accent for this character. "Or the coast of Meek," said Farmer Pullman. "How far is it?" the visitor asked. 6 days' ride," answered Farmer Sally. "We'll never make it," the man said darkly. At that, the silk-robed lady slumped in her saddle and fell to the ground. I don't know why that's funny to me. Maybe it's because I know how this story goes. The villagers, moved to compassion, despite their concerns about disease, brought the fallen lady and her companions into the nearest house. They were given water and made comfortable in beds of straw, and a dozen villagers crowded around them, offering help. "Give them space," said Farmer Pullman. "They're exhausted. They need rest." "No, they need a doctor," said Farmer Sally. "We aren't sick," the man said. "We're hungry. Our supplies ran out over a week ago, and we haven't had a bite to eat since then." Farmer Sally wondered why such wealthy people hadn't simply bought food from fellow travelers on the road, but she was too polite to ask. Instead, she ordered some village boys to run and fetch bowls of swampweed soup and millet bread and what little goat rump was left over from the festival. But when it was laid before the visitors, they turned the food away. I don't mean to be rude," said the man, "but we can't eat this." "I know it's a humble spread," said Farmer Sally. and you're probably used to feasts fit for kings. But it's all we have.
It isn't that, the man said. Grains, vegetables, animal meat. Our bodies simply can't process them. And if we force ourselves to eat it, it will only make us weaker. The villagers were confused.
If you can't eat grains, vegetables, or animals, asked Farmer Pullman, then what can you eat?
People, the man replied. Everyone in the small house took a step back from the visitors.
Oh, I think there was an annotation we missed. The coast of Meek, by the way, is a historic zone of exile. I think that's funnier that I caught that after. Alright, let us continue with the story.
You mean to tell us you're cannibals?
Said Farmer Hayworth.
By nature, not by choice, the man replied. But yes.
He went on to reassure the shocked villagers that they were civilized cannibals and never killed innocent people. They and others like them had worked out an arrangement with the king by which they agreed never to kidnap and eat people against their will, and in turn they were allowed to purchase, at terrific expense, the severed limbs of accident victims and the bodies of hanged criminals. This composed the entirety of their diet. They were now on their way to the coast of Meek because it was the place in Britain that boasted both the highest rate of accidents and the most deaths by hanging. And so food was relatively abundant, if not exactly plentiful. Even though cannibals in those days were wealthy, they nearly always went hungry. Firmly law-abiding, they were doomed to live lives of perpetual undernourishment, forever tormented by an appetite they could rarely satisfy. And it seemed that the cannibals who had arrived in Swamp Monk, already starving, and many days from Meek, were now doomed to die. Having learned all this, the people of any other village, peculiar or otherwise, would have shrugged their shoulders and let the cannibals starve. But the Swamp Monkians were compassionate, almost to a fault. And so no one was surprised when Farmer Hayworth took a step forward, hobbling on crutches, and said, "It just so happens that I lost my leg in an accident a few days ago. I tossed it into the swamp, but I'm sure I could find it again if the eels haven't eaten it yet." The cannibal's eyes brightened. "You would do that?" the cannibal woman said, brushing long hair back from a skeletal cheek. "You would do that?" said the cannibal. "I admit it feels a little strange," Hayworth said, "but we can't just let you die." The other villagers agreed. Hayworth hobbled to the swamp and found his leg, fought off the eels that were nibbling at it, and brought it to the cannibals on a platter. One of the cannibal men handed Hayworth a purse of money. What's this?" asked Hayworth.
"Payment,"
the cannibal man said.
"The same amount the king charges us."
I can't accept this," said Hayworth. But when he tried to return the purse, the cannibal put his hands behind his back and smiled. "It's only fair. You saved our lives," the cannibal said. The villagers turned away politely as the cannibals began to eat,
Farmer Hayworth opened the purse, looked inside, and turned a bit pale. It was more money than he'd ever seen in his life. Excuse me. The cannibals spent the next few days eating and recovering their strength, and when they were finally ready to set off again for the coast of Meek, this time with good directions, the villagers all gathered to wish them goodbye. When the cannibals saw Farmer Hayworth, they noticed he was walking without the aid of crutches. "I don't understand," said one of the cannibal men, astounded. "I thought we ate your leg." "You did," said Hayworth, "but when the peculiars of swamp milk lose their limbs, they grow them back again." Let's find where the little anecdote is, because there's right here. So Millard put a little annotation for us here, so I'm going to read the annotation on the bottom. There was a time, a certain long ago Halcyon era, when peculiars could live together, unlooped and in the open. Oh, this is if you're a big Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children fan and you're like, these people are not in loops? What are you talking about? A loop is like a time capsule that a certain type of peculiar called an imbrine can create to protect peculiars. It can be a loop of a minute, a second, an hour, a day, a century, I think, if you're really powerful, or even like a week at a time. But the reason why this practice was developed was once peculiars started to become under exile, they created communities in order to keep themselves safe and alive, but they just hid away. So anyhow, so this was part of a time when peculiars could live out in the open without fear of persecution. Peculiars of the day often divided themselves into groups according to their ability, a practice now frowned upon as it encourages tribalism and interpeculiar hostility. The cannibal got a funny look on his face, seemed about to say more, then thought better of it, and he got on his horse and rode away with the others. Weeks passed. Life in Swamp Monk returned to normal for everyone but Farmer Hayworth. He was distracted, and during the day he could often be found leaning on his mucking stick, gazing out over the swamps. He was thinking about the purse of money, which he'd hidden in a hole. What should he do with it? His friends all made suggestions. "You could buy a wardrobe of beautiful clothes," said Farmer Bettelheim. "But what would I do with them?" Farmer Hayworth replied. "I work in the swamps all day. They would only get ruined." "You could buy a library of fine books," suggested Farmer Heagle. "But I can't read," replied Hayworth, "and neither can anyone in Swamp Muck." Farmer Bashlard's suggestion was silliest of all. "You should buy an elephant," he said, "and use it to haul all your swamp weed to market." "But it would eat all the swamp weed before I could sell it," said Hayworth, becoming exasperated. "If only I could do something about my house. The reeds do little to keep the wind out, and it gets drafty in the winter." "You could use the money to paper the walls," said Farmer Anderson. "Don't be an idiot," Farmer Sally piped up. "Just buy a new house." And that's exactly what Hayworth did. He built a house made of wood, the first ever constructed in Swamp Monk. It was small but sturdy and kept out the wind, and it even had a door that swung open and shut on hinges. Farmer Hayworth was very proud, and his house was the envy of the entire village. Some days later, another group of visitors arrived. There were 4 of them, 3 men and 1 woman. Because they were dressed in fine clothes and rode on Arabian horses, the villagers knew right away who they were: law-abiding cannibals from the coast of Meek. Also, the source of cannibals' wealth, the manufacture of candy and children's toys. There is no more elaboration on that. Some days later. Oh goodness. These cannibals, however, did not appear to be starving. Again the villagers gathered round to marvel at them. The cannibal woman, who wore a shirt spun with gold thread, pants buttoned with pearls, and boots trimmed with foxfur, said, "Friends of ours came to your village some weeks ago, and you showed them great kindness. Because we are not a people accustomed to kindness, we have come to thank you in person." And the cannibals got down from their horses and bowed to the villagers, and went about shaking the villagers' hands. The villagers were amazed at the softness of the cannibal's skin. "One more thing before we go," said the cannibal woman. "We heard you have a unique talent. Is it true you regrow lost limbs?" The villagers told them it was true. "In that case," the woman said, "we have a modest proposal for you. The limbs we eat on the coast of Meek are rarely fresh, and we are tired of rotten food. Would you sell us some of yours? We would pay you handsomely, of course." She opened her saddle pack to reveal a wad of money and jewels. The villagers goggled at the money, but they felt uncertain and turned away to whisper amongst themselves. "We can't sell our limbs." "Oh, hold up. We can't sell our limbs," Farmer Bowman reasoned. I need my legs for walking." "Then only sell your arms," said Farmer Bachelard. "But we need our arms for swamp mucking," said Farmer Hayworth. "If we're being paid for arms, we won't need to grow swamp weed anymore," said Farmer Anderson. "We hardly earn anything from farming anyway." It doesn't seem right selling ourselves that way," said Farmer Hayworth. "Easy for you to say," said Farmer Bettelheim. "You've got a house made of wood." I'm not really sure why all farmers are southern and kind of old in my head. And so the villagers made a deal with the cannibals. Those who were right-handed would sell their left arms, and those who were left-handed would sell their right arms, and they'd keep on selling them as they grew back. That way, they'd have a steady source of income and would never again have to spend all day mucking or endure a difficult harvest. Everyone seemed pleased with the arrangement except Farmer Hayworth, who rather enjoyed swamp mucking and was sorry to see the village give up its traditional trade, even if it wasn't very profitable, compared to selling one's limbs to cannibals anyhow. But there was nothing Farmer Hayworth could do, and he watched helplessly as all his neighbors gave up farming, let their swamps go fallow, and hacked their arms off. Their peculiarity wasn't such that it didn't hurt much, and the limbs came off rather easily, like a lizard's tail. They used the money they earned to buy food from the market at Chipping Whippet. Goat rump became a dish eaten daily rather than annually, and to build houses made of wood, like Farmer Hayworth's. Everyone wanted a door that swung on hinges, of course. Then Farmer Pullman built a house with 2 floors. 2 floors. And soon everyone wanted a house with 2 floors. 2 floors. Then Farmer Sally built a house with 2 floors and a gabled roof. And soon everyone wanted houses with 2 floors and a gabled roof. Every time the villagers' arms regrew and were hacked off and sold again, they would use the money to add to their houses. Finally, the houses grew so big, and there was hardly any room between them, and the village square, once wide and open, was reduced to a narrow alley. Farmer Bachelard was the first one to hit upon a solution. He would buy a big plot of land on the outskirts of the village and build a new house there, even larger than his current one, which had incidentally 3 doors that swung on hinges, 2 floors, a gabled roof, and a porch. This was around the time when the villagers stopped going by Farmer This and Farmer That, and started calling themselves Mr. This and Mrs. That, because they were no longer farmers, except for Farmer Hayworth, who kept on mucking his swamp and refused to sell any more limbs to the cannibals. He liked his simple house just fine. He insisted and didn't even use it that much because he still enjoyed sleeping in his swamp after a hard day's work. His friends thought him silly and old-fashioned and stopped coming by to see him. The once humble village of Swamp Monk expanded rapidly as villagers bought larger and larger tracts of land upon which they built larger and more ornate houses. To finance this, they began selling the cannibals both an arm and a leg. The leg always on the opposite side from the arm to make balancing easier, and learned to get around on crutches. The cannibals, whose wealth and hunger both seemed inexhaustible, were very happy with this. Then Mr. Pullman tore down his wooden house and replaced it with one made of brick, which touched off a race amongst the villagers to see who could build the grandest brick house. But Mr. Bettelheim bested them all. He built a beautiful house made of honey-colored limestone, the sort of home only the richest merchants and shipping whippet lived in. He had afforded it by selling his arm and both of his legs. "He's gone too far," complained Mrs. Sally over goat rump and sandwiches in her fancy new restaurant the village had built. Not her, but in the fancy new restaurant. Her friends agreed. "How does he plan to enjoy his 3-floor house?" said Mrs. Wanamaker, "if he can't even walk up the stairs?" I feel like at this point they've adopted British accents. That's my headcanon. Where is my spot? If he can't even walk up the stairs. It was just at that moment that Mr. Bettelheim came into the restaurant, carried by a burly man from the neighboring village. "I've hired a man to carry me up and down the stairs and anywhere else I want to go," he said proudly. "I don't need legs." The ladies were astounded. But soon they had sold their legs too, and all across the village, brick houses were being torn down and replaced by giant houses made of limestone. The cannibals by this time had abandoned the coast of Meek to live in the forest near Swamp Monk. There was no point anymore in subsisting on a meager diet of hanged criminals and accident victims' limbs, when the villagers' limbs were fresher, tastier, and more plentiful than anything available in Meek. Their forest homes were modest because they gave so much of their money to the villagers, but the cannibals were nevertheless content, much happier to live in huts with full bellies than to go hungry in mansions. As the villagers and the cannibals came to depend on one another, the appetites of each other continued to grow. The cannibals became fat, having exhausted every recipe they had for arms and legs. They began to wonder what the villagers' ears tasted like. But the villagers would not sell their ears because ears did not grow back. That is, until Mr. Bachelard, carried in the arms of his burly servant, paid a secret visit to the cannibals' forest and asked them how much they'd be willing to pay. He'd still be able to hear without his ears. He reasoned, and though it would make him a bit ugly, the fine house of white marble he'd be able to construct with the proceeds would be beautiful enough to compensate. Now, the financially astute among you may be asking, why didn't Mr. Bachelard just save up money from the ongoing sale of his arms and legs until he could afford a marble house? It's because he couldn't save money, because he'd taken out a very large loan from a bank in order to buy the land which his limestone house was built. Now he owed the bank an arm and a leg every month just to pay interest on the loan. So he needed to sell his ears. The cannibals offered Mr. Bachelard an exorbitant sum. Mr. Bachelard snipped off his ears, happy to be rid of them, and replaced his limestone house with the marble home of his dreams. It was the most beautiful house in the village, and perhaps in all of Oddfordshire. Though the villagers of Swampmuck talked behind Bachelard's back about how ugly he'd made himself and how foolish it was to sell ears that would never grow back. They all paid him visits, and all had their servants carry them through the marble rooms and up and down the marble staircases. And by the time they left, each was green with envy. By this time, none of the villagers but Farmer Hayworth had legs, and very few had arms. For a while, they all insisted on keeping one arm so they could point at things and feed themselves, but they realized that a servant could lift a spoon or a glass to their lips just as easily, and it was not much more trouble to say, "Fetch this for me," or "Fetch that for me," than to point across a room at something. So arms became seen as needless luxuries, and the villagers, reduced to limbless torsos, would travel from place to place in silken sacks slung across their servants' shoulders. Ears soon went the way of arms. The villagers pretended they had not called Mr. Bachelard ugly. "He doesn't look so bad," said Mr. Bettelheim. "We could wear earmuffs," suggested Mr. Anderson. And so their ears were snipped and sold, and marble houses were built. The village gained a reputation for its architectural beauty, and what had once been a backwater visit only by accident became a tourist destination. A hotel was built and several more restaurants. Goat rump sandwiches were not even on the menu. The people of Swampmuck pretended they had never even heard of goat rump sandwiches. They were too good for it. Tourists sometimes lingered near Farmer Hayworth's modest, flat-roofed house of wood, curious about the contrast between his simple home and the palaces that surrounded it. He would explain that he preferred the simple life of a four-limbed swampweed farmer and show them around his patch of swamp. His was the last bit of swamp in Swampmuck, as all the others had been filled in with dirt to make room for houses. The eyes of the country were on Swampmuck and its beautiful marble homes. The home's owners loved the attention, but were desperate to stand out in some way, as every house was nearly identical. Each wanted to be known as the owner of the most beautiful house in Swampmuck. but they were already using their arms and legs every month just to pay interest on their enormous loans. Excuse me. And they had already sold their ears. They began to approach the cannibals with new ideas. "Would you loan me money with my nose as collateral?" asked Mrs. Sally. "No," the cannibals said, "but we would happily buy your nose outright." "But if I cut my nose off, I'll look like a monster," she said. "You could wear a scarf around your face," they suggested. Mrs. Sally refused, and from her sack she instructed her servant to take her home. Next, Mr. Bettelheim came to see the cannibals. This part of the story gets crazy. They are bonkers. Crazy with greed. Next, Mr. Bettelheim came to see the cannibals. "Would you buy my nephew?" he whispered, his servant pushing an 8-year-old boy before the cannibals. "Absolutely not," the cannibals replied, and gave the terrified boy a candy before sending him home. Mrs. Sally returned a few days later. "Okay," she said with a sigh. "I'll sell you my nose." I'm trying to go for Cockney, but that went Southern. She had it replaced with a false one made of gold, and with the money she earned, built an enormous gold dome on top of her marble house. You may have guessed where this is going. The whole village sold their noses and built gold domes and turrets and towers. Then they sold their eyes, just one each, and used the money to dig moats around their houses, which they filled with wine and exotic drunken fish. They said that binocular vision was a luxury anyway, and needed mainly for throwing and catching things, which, lacking arms, they didn't do anymore, and it only took one eye to appreciate the beauty of their homes. Now the cannibals were civilized and law-abiding, but they weren't saints. They were living in huts in the forest and cooking their food over campfires, while the villagers lived in manors and palaces waited on by servants. So the cannibals moved into the villagers' houses. There were so many rooms in the houses that it took the villagers some time to notice. But when they finally did, they were angry. "We never said you could live with us," the villagers said. "You're dirty cannibals who eat human flesh. Go stay in the woods." "If you don't let us live in your houses," the cannibals replied, "we'll stop buying your limbs and go back to meat. Then you won't be able to pay your loans and you'll lose everything." The villagers didn't know what to do. They didn't want cannibals in their house, but neither could they imagine going back to the way they used to live. In fact, things would be worse than before. Not only would they be homeless, disfigured, and half blind, but they wouldn't even have swamps to farm because they'd filled them all in. It was unthinkable. Grudgingly, they let the cannibals stay. The cannibals spread out among all the houses in the village, except Farmer Hayworth's. No one wanted to live in his crude wooden shack. They took the master suites, the largest bedrooms, and made the villagers move into their own guest rooms, some of which did not even have an ensuite bathroom. Mr. Bachelard was forced to live in his chicken coop. That's the guy who wanted to sacrifice his nephew. Or maybe it was Mr. Anderson. Either way. Where was I? Oh yes. Mr. Anderson moved into his cellar. was very nice for a cellar, but still. The villagers complained incessantly about the new arrangement. They still had tongues, after all. "Your cooking smells make me sick," Mrs. Sally said to her cannibals. "The tourists keep asking about you, and it's embarrassing," Mr. Pullman shouted at his cannibals, startling them as they read quietly in the study. "If you don't move out, I'll tell the authorities you've been kidnapping children and cooking them into caches," Mr. Bettelheim threatened. What a douche. "One doesn't cook a quiche, one bakes a quiche," replied his cannibal, a cultivated Spaniard named Hector. "I don't care," shouted Mr. Bettelheim, going quite red in the face. After some weeks of this, Hector decided he couldn't take it anymore. He offered Mr. Bettelheim every penny he had left on earth if he would just sell Hector his tongue. Mr. Bettelheim did not reject this offer out of hand. He gave it careful thought and consideration. Without his tongue, he'd no longer be able to complain or make threats against Hector. But with the money Hector was promising, he could build a second house on the property and live there, away from Hector. And he'd no longer have anything to complain about. And who else in the village would have not one, but two golden-domed marble houses? Now, if Mr. Bettelheim had asked Farmer Hayworth's advice, his old friend would have told him not to take the cannibal's deal. "If the smell of Hector's cooking bothered you, come and live with me," Hayworth would have offered. "I have more than enough room in my house." But Mr. Bettelheim had shunned Farmer Hayworth, as had the rest of the village, so he didn't ask. And even if he had, Bettelheim was too proud, and would rather live without a tongue than in Hayworth's sad little house. So Bettelheim went to Hector and said, "Okay." Or, how would you say that in a Cockney accent? "Okay." More sounds Valley Girl. Hector drew his carving knife, which was always sheathed at his side. "Yes?" "Yes," Bettelheim said, and stuck out his tongue. Hector did the deed. He stuffed Bettelheim's mouth with cotton to stop the bleeding. Sounds like an innuendo. Get my mind out of the gutter, Beau. He carried the tongue into the kitchen, fried it in truffle oil with a pinch of salt, and ate it. Then he took all the money he'd promised Bettelheim, gave it to Bettelheim's servants, and dismissed them. Limbless, tongueless, and very angry, Bettelheim grunted and wiggled around on the floor. Hector picked him up, carried him outside, and tied him to a stake in a shady part of the back garden. He watered and fed Bettelheim twice a day, and like a fruiting vine, Bettelheim grew limbs for Hector to eat. Hector felt a little bad about it, but not too bad. Eventually, he married a nice cannibal girl, and together they raised a cannibal family, all fed by the peculiar man in the back garden. Such was the fate of all of the villagers, all but Farmer Hayworth, who kept his limbs and lived in his little house and farmed his swamp like he always had. He didn't bother his new neighbors, and they didn't bother him. He had everything he needed, and so did they. And they lived happily ever after.
that does it for this story, this narration. Yeah, this thing that I just did. I'm closing it up, ending the video because we got her done. We did it. So, I hope you enjoyed this story reading session. I will 100% be doing more. Let me know if there's any specific books you'd like me to read. I may just oblige. So, I hope you have a wonderful night or day